Ladies and gentlemen, may I welcome you very warmly to St Bride's for this year's Olsen Lecture. Tom Olsen was an outstanding author, journalist and editor who was an enthusiastic supporter of St Bride's, so it is our privilege to honour his memory each year by hosting the lecture that bears his name. This year is the 400th anniversary of the voyage of the Mayflower, and a great many exciting and high-profile events were planned for 2020 to mark that quatercentenary, until along came COVID-19, which sadly but inevitably caused quite a number of them to be postponed. So I am delighted and relieved that we are able to mark that very special anniversary here through this annual lecture, albeit in a slightly different format than originally planned, above all because we could not have hoped for a more authoritative speaker on the subject. Rebecca Fraser is a writer, historian and broadcaster whose work is widely respected and whose range of interests and subject matter seems to know no bounds. Her 2017 book, The Mayflower Generation, the Winslow Family and the Fight for the New World, is not only a meticulous work of historical scholarship, it is also a beautifully written account of a riveting period of history. If you have not yet read it, go and order a copy immediately. St Bride's Church gets several mentions within its pages, so it must be good. Our special thanks to Kaizo, who have once again been kind enough to sponsor this lecture, and there will be an opportunity for questions at the end. If you would like to submit a question during the lecture, please use the live chat facility on YouTube. It is now my very great pleasure to hand over to this evening's lecturer, Rebecca Fraser, who will speak to us on the theme, The Mayflower 400 Years On, the Pilgrim Fathers and their quest for freedom. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. At the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower ship departing for the New World, I'm delighted to be speaking at this extraordinarily historic church in a lecture series to honour the memory of the distinguished journalist Tom Olsen. Although there have been churches on this spot dedicated to St Bride's since the Saxon era, this great church also has tremendous connections with the New World. The parents of Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America, were married here. Her grandfather, John White, painted delicate watercolours of the American Indians and was briefly governor of Roanoke. That was Sir Walter Raleigh's late 16th century attempt at founding the first permanent English settlement off the coast of what is today North Carolina. Now, we don't know what happened to the Roanoke colony, everybody vanished, but we do know about the Mayflower, with which St Bride's has close links, celebrated by the magnificent oak-canopied reredos behind me. It was raised by American friends of St Bride's in honour of the Pilgrim Father, Edward Winslow, whose portrait I'm standing beside. Long associated with the church, he was a printer, and his parents were married here. And Edward Winslow was not to stay in England. He sailed on the Mayflower to found a new world and was governor of Plymouth Colony 3 times. Today, the most important holiday on the American national calendar is Thanksgiving, and with so many Americans now living in London, it is a date for many here as well. Thanksgiving centres on the Pilgrim Fathers feast, with the American Missioners Company, which is also closely associated with St Bride's, would be given a royal charter to supervise printing. As was recently mentioned by the Prime Minister, the British have a long history of being a freedom-loving people. But in the early 17th century, the free press was not in England, but Holland. That press was dedicated to the all-consuming subject of the new reformed religion of Protestantism. It began with Luther's revolt against the papacy and went on from there. Because of their 80-year war of independence against Spain, the Dutch supported anything for the cause of Protestantism, from radical foreign churches exiled from their homelands to foreign presses. In England, extreme Puritan writing was illegal if it challenged the Church of England's religious settlement, even though a large number of people, whether highly educated or not highly educated, were influenced by it. One way congregations got round vicars they found too conservative was to establish Puritan lectureships of unbeneficed clergymen to preach. By 1630, 90% of London parishes had such posts. What was being printed in Holland was so popular in England that it was smuggled into the country in all kinds of ships. Many of the people writing this material were some of the university's most distinguished theologians, exiled by the English government. But often, as with the controversial divine William Ames, what went on abroad stayed abroad. Though the Bishop of London refused to allow him to preach, Ames was employed as military chaplain by the English governor of the Dutch town of Brill, Sir Horace Vere. The London printer to whom Pilgrim Edward Winslow was apprenticed was a dedicated Puritan who also smuggled in these illegal books. In 1617, Winslow decided that he wanted to be part of the group of activists dedicatedly printing tracts and sermons to change thought and change manners, to stop the backsliding that he and other Protestants feared was bringing England back to Rome. This fear was to become overwhelming as the century drew on. By 1640, 20,000 Puritans had fled the reforms of Charles I and Archbishop Laud. But when the Mayflower sailed, the English population was in two minds. Most of them hoped, and this stood for many clergymen, that things would get better. They preferred to remain within the Church of England and reform it from within. But the people who hired the Mayflower demanded much greater freedom of worship. William Brewster was one of the initiators of a small discussion group of people that was so dissatisfied with the conservative nature of the Elizabethan religious settlement that he and others set up what today is known as a separatist church. Eventually, under James I's crackdown against nonconformism, Brewster and his church fled to the Netherlands, and he set up a Puritan printing press in Leiden for whom Winslow was to work. Now, this word separatist was to occasion a great deal of grief. Then as now, English people did not want to be perceived as unpatriotic. Separatism was a dirty word. Even the very influential pastor to the Mayflower Church, John Robinson, would eventually repudiate as separatist because that seemed to deny being part of the historic past of Christianity. The problem was, and this was a problem all over England, a newly literate population started to think there was a discrepancy between the Church of England and the ancient church Christ established in Palestine. They were encouraged to read the Bible by the new translations published by printers like those in St. Bride's Churchyard, but their intellectual leaders, academics at Oxford and Cambridge colleges, and their students, now vicars who were Greek and Latin scholars, began to question all kinds of things, especially in church services. They were seeking purity, a pared-back religion, not one full of traditions. Many seemed to derive from the Roman Catholic Church and so were suspect. Now, throughout the 16th century, you get a debate going on about authority for the new Protestant churches. What should be taken from the Roman Catholic Church, which after all was founded by St. Peter, and what should not, being a human accretion? How could a new church create priests? Separatist churches telling about was bishops. And one of Elizabeth I's most important professors, Thomas Cartwright, had come to the conclusion there was nothing in the Bible that suggested they existed. Abolishing them became an outrageous idea, and to James I, it seemed to threaten the monarchy, and as he remarked famously in his pithy way, no bishop, no king. He saw that radical Protestants were ultimately a democratic movement that relied on the congregation to rule, not a church hierarchy. So the less democratic, if you will, was the Presbyterian version of Protestantism, when you have the rule of elders, and then you have the congregational churches, when you do have elders, but the decisions are made by the congregation, as in William Brewster's small church. That was the church Edward Winslow joined in Leiden. And in Leiden, he was printing all sorts of things believed by Puritans that had become illegal, why Puritans should not make the sign of the cross or kneel in church, printed guides to Puritan ethics, and so on. Previously, they had been discussed in informal groups, those personal interpretations of the Bible known as prophesying, but that was now forbidden. Because of the hugely influential Puritan movement, this secret Puritan literature was read in England. The Leiden church relished the freedom of the Netherlands, but the Netherlands had only been a safe place as long as there was a truce between Holland and Spain. By 1620, that truce would be at an end. The church had to decide whether to return, where the Church of England was becoming much more interventionist, or find somewhere else to settle. What was believed to be the largely empty space of America seemed to offer the perfect freedom their church required, a freedom from corruption and autocracy. They could not face life in prison in England again, or possibly worse, nor could they give up their religion. So 2 ships were hired, the Speedwell and the Mayflower. The Mayflower sprung a leak and had to turn back, so the Mayflower sailed on her own to America. Now, one of the most famous aspects of the Mayflower was an agreement drawn up on board known as the Mayflower Compact. Magna Carta had established the idea of the rule of law, but that was a law decided by the monarch. In the Mayflower Compact, the Pilgrims pledged their loyalty to laws they made themselves. Although the document itself vanished long ago, possibly due to being looted in Boston by British soldiers, their words in which they pledged themselves a civil body politic make moving reading. They were written by impoverished, persecuted, not very well-educated people who had signed over all their earnings to the company financing their colony. But they said they would enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. Now, throughout the 18th and 19th century, the Pilgrims' Compact became the object of fascination. As a first experiment in consensual government, it seemed to anticipate the social contract theory of the philosopher John Locke, which heavily influenced the American Declaration of Independence. Locke's argument was that human beings, not God, had created government, that people consented to be ruled because of an implicit agreement between a people and their government that it would protect the natural rights of the people. It justified overthrowing the government if it failed to protect these rights. Revolutionary leaders and lawyers drawing up the Constitution after the American Wars of Independence became captivated by the Pilgrims' Compact, even though it was really just a rough agreement drawn up to make sure that all the settlers would obey their elected officials. And of course, Locke started writing 50 years after the Mayflower had sailed, when most of the Pilgrims were no longer alive. But to American leaders, the Mayflower Compact had something magical about it. It corresponded to the state of nature Locke described in his theory of civil society. And the future president, John Quincy Adams, described the compact rhapsodically as perhaps the only instance in human history of that positive, original social compact which speculative philosophers have imagined as the only legitimate source of government. It was the result of circumstances and discussions which had occurred during the nature of civil government, abstracted from the political institutions of their native country, had been an object of their serious meditation. Now, one of the problems for the Pilgrims, which for sure was the subject of angry discussions during their passage from Europe, was that everything had to be held in common for the first 7 years. Even before the Mayflower sailed from Southampton, it occasioned much annoyance. And in fact, future American revolutionary statesmen who had assistance from revolutionary France would be very anxious to play down anything which could be perceived as Jacobin principles. Indeed, after the Second World War, in the McCarthy era in America, what were misinterpreted as communist principles were hastily dismissed, and books were written to show they weren't communist. But for 19th century Americans, the Pilgrims were a successful colony in northern North America where they could worship as they pleased. They were admired by constitutional historians as Puritans, the sect that had preserved freedoms against royal absolutism. But was the Mayflower Compact really a founding document of American democracy? In some ways, yes, and the two most recent historians writing about the colony, Frank Bremer and John Turner, have high praise for what they have found to be the exceptionally broadly based democracy found in New England's town hall meetings, which derive from the congregational traditions of the Leiden Church. In one of his letters to his flock in the tedious period waiting at Southampton for the ships to be ready and enough money to leave, John Robinson told his flock that they must obey whoever was in office, even though they didn't have any people of social eminence on the voyage. And in a very deferential society, this was a very important new indicator. And one of the fascinating things about that would not be enfranchised for over 200 years in Old England. And the Pilgrims clearly had a very strong sense, what we might today even call an entitled sense of the free liberties they were owed as English people. The signatories also included 2 indentured servants. So did they include women? Because there are lots of paintings with women apparently at the signing or about to sign the compact. Well, they didn't sign the compact, but the history of the colony they established suggests women had enormous freedom compared to Old England and many other New England colonies. There were even rumours in London in the 1620s that women were allowed to vote in the colony. And historians now believe it was because it was known that women had a role in church events in Plymouth, which was why people wondered whether women had a vote in civil matters. Though the vote rumour was hastily denied, women actually had a great deal of influence and what we today would call soft power in Plymouth. 30 years after the Mayflower landed, married women could make contracts and were allowed to run taverns. They had to appear in court to agree to land sales, likewise to any issue regarding their children. And again, you don't get this in Old England till over 200 years later. In Plymouth, if the money left to a widow was inadequate, courts could intervene. You could say this was the effect of the American frontier, but it didn't happen in Massachusetts, just Plymouth. And searching for reasons, it seems it was probably due to the huge respect for women imbued in the Mayflower Church by their pastor, John Robinson. Very sadly, the Pilgrims' investors in the City of London were so nervous about the church's separatist and therefore scandalous reputation, they had never allowed Robinson to join his flock in the New World. And very sadly, he died only 4 years after the Mayflower sailed in Leiden. As many of you will know, much 17th century European thought was based on the premise that not only were women the weaker sex physically, but they were weaker morally. In a Bible-based culture, since Eve was responsible for Adam's fall, a huge number of consequences flow from that. But, Eve or no Eve, women had been members of informal congregational gatherings since the time of John Wycliffe. And there were quite a number of Puritan patronesses like Lady Elizabeth Bowes and Mrs. Rose Hickman, who was a distant relation of John Locke, in fact, who allowed gatherings, secret churches, in their large houses. And Robinson also had 3 very powerful sisters-in-law who moved their families to Leiden out of solidarity, and perhaps that influenced him. And Robinson believed that God had created men and women of what he called an equal perfection, and he thought that their role in Christian churches needed expanding. And he found evidence that the important women in the New Testament who were disciples of Jesus had been deaconesses, He believed women could speak in church meetings if they felt an urge, and if there was some problem in their church which no man would tackle, a woman could reprove the church, and this was extraordinary stuff. But Robinson's influence had an important other effect, and that was on the Pilgrims' relations with the American Indian tribes. He taught the Leiden Church that they should not impinge on the lives of the Native Americans, except to offer what he considered to be the great gift of Christianity. Robinson hoped for a native church, what he called further light coming to the world, which had begun with Luther and carried on with Calvin. He wanted further revelation. But that was very much not to be imposed. Robinson would severely reprimand the Pilgrims when they attacked a local tribe. He told them that they were not magistrates or rulers over the American Indians. And the Pilgrims' first actions in America were unlike those who came after them. Presumptuously, to today's way of thinking, the European powers had theoretically divided the American continent into spheres of influence, Spanish, English, and so on. All settlers had to get royal charters, and they owned their land from the king. But the Pilgrims insisted on purchasing land from the Wampanoags. They would commission Roger Williams, the founder of Rhode Island, to look into what would become a very vexed issue of land ownership. In the early 17th century, there was tremendous interest in the American Indian tribes. Like the invention of the internet, the European Columbus's discovery of America altered everything. Philosophers and scholars stretched their mind to fit the new continent and its inhabitants into a Christian Eurocentric chronology. Were the American Indians a people who had survived the flood? One theory, which had currency until the mid-17th century, was that they could be the lost tribes of Israel. English colonizers were influenced by the discovery of scholarly texts in the Renaissance. They knew Tacitus's account of the valor of non-Romans like the British and German. It was suggested that the American Indian tribes could insert vigor into a Europe as decadent as the Roman Empire. And the Algonquian Indian princess Pocahontas, the daughter of Powhatan, the leader of the tribes surrounding the new settlement of Jamestown, Virginia, had actually visited London in 1617, and she even lodged in Ludgate Hill, so close to St. Bride's, and she sat on James I's right hand at a public masque written by Ben Jonson and had her portrait painted. At first, the Pilgrims were extremely respectful of the Native Americans and grateful to them. Having drawn up this famous compact, the brave but inexperienced group of travellers now had to explore the unknown continent in the middle of a very cold winter. They did not have proper maps, though they had some sketches from John Smith of Jamestown fame. They would not let him come on the expedition. He offered, but it is thought that he might not have been quite serious-minded enough for them. And so they were really entirely reliant on the Wampanoags and their leaders. For 10 years or so, Plymouth Colony led an exemplary life. The colonists were good friends, close friends with the Native American tribes, some of whom lived with them, some attended the services in their meeting house. Edward Winslow wrote a very important account of the American Indian civilization with which he had great sympathy. There was a real cordiality here, and it also advantaged both peoples. The Wampanoag had suffered from the terrible plagues which began to sweep the American continent's powerful inland neighbours who hadn't been affected by the plague, while the Pilgrims needed the access to the fur trade the Wampanoags could provide. So the Pilgrims have freedom to practice their own religion, and they have freedom from bishops. But as there starts to be a more religious conservative movement in Old England, dissatisfaction with the Church of England became much more widespread under Charles I and the future Archbishop Laud. Whereas the Pilgrim Fathers had been perceived as quite extreme in their views, they now started to be looked at, as it were, as canaries down the mine, proof people could move to North America. As the poet George Herbert wrote in 1633, the emphasis on sacraments and ceremonial increased, and lectureships, the solace of Puritans, were forbidden. the Church of England was widely feared to be travelling further towards Roman Catholicism. And during the 1630s, 20,000 people emigrated from England to America, and some clashes started to arise. The influx of large numbers of English people had a huge effect, especially on relations between Plymouth and the Wampanoag. The new settlers at Boston were better educated than the Pilgrim Fathers and much less open-minded, and there were many, many more of them. They did not want to get to know the Native Americans as the Pilgrims had. Boston had many clergymen and intellectuals in their midst who did not have the same easygoing approach the Pilgrims had had to the New World. And a very anxious mood starts to take hold of New England, beginning with the challenge to orthodoxy presented by Anne Hutchinson, a woman of great intellect and charisma. And sadly, at a time when all the settlers were looking for signs of God's favour, Mistress Hutchinson's disagreements become a sign that the New World was not so uncorrupt, that Satan was in the New World, and as suspicion starts to take off about the Native American communities, that they are part of Satan operating against the godly, and the American Indian tribes themselves begin to become suspicious that the English planned to take over their country. There was a war between the Picard Indians and the English, which Plymouth was reluctant to join, but it was really occasioned by more and more settlers arriving, and it had a terrible knock-on effect. Although Native American tribes themselves made people they captured slaves, they also adopted them into their tribes. But after the war, American Indians were horrified at some of their people becoming servants and slaves who could be sold to other English people. At the same time, as always been the case since its founding, Harvard College was established to educate promising American Indians as well as English young people. I think there was always a sense amongst many English people that they should help American Indians through education, whether by taking them into their homes or founding schools. But after the war, the need to educate Native Americans and convert them to Christianity becomes more imperative, not just for philanthropic reasons. It was seen as a way of lessening tensions and probably gaining some kind of control. About 10 years after the Picard War, the Boston government decided praying towns were the answer to fears about security. American Indians who converted to Christianity are asked to wear Western European clothing and live in Western housing. In one letter, the Narragansett Indians asked that a petition be presented to the high sachems of England that they might not be forced from their religion. And Roger Williams complained to his friend Cromwell about this, saying in a memorable quote, "The tribes have been more friendly in this wilderness than our native countrymen in our own land." And just a year after the war ends, in 1638, the first ship arrived in the new port of Boston, whose passengers included slaves from Africa, part of the new triangular trade with the West Indies. And from then on, there seems to have been a coarsening of thought, a sense of racial difference in a bad way, and not much preoccupation with some communities' liberty. And I think that as Boston starts to be the senior partner in New England, because it is bigger and wealthier, it begins to take on the lead on issues where Plymouth often follows very reluctantly. But there are other changes. As New England grew in popularity with the founding of Massachusetts and Connecticut, merchants and businessmen and women arrived who either belonged to the Church of England and did not like congregational churches, or who did not wish to belong to a requirement of citizenship for almost 40 years. Their more powerful sister colony, Massachusetts, did. And these new merchants start to protest about gaining full civil rights without church membership. At present, if you were not a local church member, it debarred you from much commercial and political life. And most interestingly, by the 1640s, the majority of Plymouth voters, so this is Pilgrim Fathers and their children, and were in sympathy with this idea freedom of religion, and they would have liked to have had freedom of religion at Plymouth. But two of the most important people who are William Bradford, the historian and governor for 30 years, and Edward Winslow, never allowed it to be put to the vote. And that was because they felt New England had been established by their godly Protestant churches, and nothing should be allowed to dilute that. So they might be champions of freedom, but it had to be their version of freedom. During the English Civil War, Edward Winslow returned to London, which is where this famous portrait was painted. It's the only one of a Pilgrim Father, and it was probably done by a member of Robert Walker's circle. Walker painted one of the best-known portraits of Oliver Cromwell. And Winslow's mission was to stop the British government interfering with the New England colonies by allowing full civil rights to non-church members. And his reasoning was fascinating. 130 years before the American Revolution, he said that all laws had to be consented to. And he said that if the English Parliament was able to impose laws upon us when New England did not have representatives in Parliament, then we should lose the liberty and freedom I conceived of English indeed. And in fact, his pleadings stopped the interference for a generation. Now, Winslow had stepped into a country in a maelstrom where freedom for some was being enlarged and for some curtailed. And he was employed by the new republic, many of whose aims he shared. And he personally superintended the sending of 100 narratives of the victory at the Battle of Worcester to New England in 1651. He was sacked for joining city figures who protested against the dissolution of the Rump Parliament. But by and large, Winslow approved of Cromwell's agenda of godly reformation. He died on board another ship, this time off Hispaniola, now the Dominican Republic, on a mission to liberate West Indian Islands from Spain, which ended in the conquest of Jamaica. Back in America, more problems about freedom arose, thanks to the English Civil War. It had liberated many radical Protestant sects who wished for a broader religious liberty, the most well-known of the Quakers. Despite their religion of peace, in America especially, the Quakers were regarded as a threat to order. Boston executed those who refused to be banished, but in Plymouth, following on from that independent mindset that there was the legacy of separatism, the Quakers were treated far more moderately, never being executed. And they had a presence in several towns. In 1675, a terrible in the New England colonies and the American Indian tribes, the result of decades of the English pushing into native land. There was a second generation in charge at Plymouth who had none of the first fascination with the Native Americans or sensitivity to their culture. Rebels were sold to the West Indies without trial as slaves. It was not what John Robinson had envisaged, and there were protests from many colonists in the old colony, but they were ignored. To sum up, thinking about the Mayflower 400 years on, the Pilgrim Fathers and their quest for freedom, very many aspects of the Pilgrim Fathers remain appealing. 1620 is still a key date in the history of Western democracy, but there were some communities who did not benefit from the Pilgrims' commitment to freedom, whether non-Protestants, American Indians, or enslaved African Americans. Even if they play a major role in the Thanksgiving legend, American Indians still call Thanksgiving the day of mourning. The 1619 Project, an initiative by the New York Times, proposes the date 1619 be added to transformative dates for the world, such as 1492 or 1620, since it is when African communities begin arriving in Virginia. Alas, though I am speaking at St. Bride's, the journalist church, in honour of Tom Olsen, I'm not sure how much the Pilgrim Fathers would have relished freedom of the press. Edward Winslow could be quite economical with the truth. At the time, the Pilgrim Father, William Bradford, portrayed the Mayflower Compact as an instrument to repress dissent, to rein in passengers who wanted too much freedom, which would be harmful to their plantation and godly mission. The Pilgrim Fathers believed in their own freedom of worship, but not necessarily everyone else's. Nevertheless, the Mayflower Compact has rightly had a glorious afterlife. The Pilgrims have stood as a remarkable beacons to many. Disliking hierarchy, Plymouth's separatist churches emphasise lay empowerment, a participatory form of church government, and independent minds. The colony's enemy and neighbour, Thomas Morton, sarcastically noted their democratic way of life meant a parliament was called for community decisions on the most banal occasions. Perhaps the last word on the Pilgrim Fathers should go to their contemporary, Governor John Winthrop. Despite his friendship with Edward Winslow, he found much to disapprove of in Plymouth. To Winthrop, because Plymouth's governor and magistrates did not have the authority to veto decisions made by the colony's freemen, Plymouth was a mere democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Rebecca, for a marvellous and very edifying lecture. It's been wonderful to hear you this evening. We have a little bit of time for a few questions. Right. I'll wait to see if any are forthcoming from our listeners and viewers. But if I can just ask really a very general question to start with. Given your wide range of academic interests, I wondered if you might say a bit more about what kindled your interest in this subject.
Well, many years ago, I read a wonderful book called A Little Commonwealth by a New England historian, John Demos, and it was so fascinating. It's sort of social history, and it's full of material culture, and I became very curious about these people, and I think I was very intrigued. Everything seemed to be against them. What was the legend about them? It was very hard to separate what they were like from the legends. But I found them very fascinating, and I think that their initial relationship with the American Indians, I thought, was absolutely wonderful and so impressive. And in fact, it is really quite sad that things go downhill because of the pressure on land, even though, of course, America was full of land. But so I became very intrigued about them, and also I think in a way the less you know about people, the more sort of curious you become, and then there are all kinds of sort of strange references to them. And then I was very curious about the portrait of Edward Winslow, because by then I knew Plymouth was a very, very poor little colony, really sort of bankrupt, and when people arrived to settle there, they were horrified because some of the people were in rags, they'd lost all their teeth, it really didn't look particularly good, and wealthy looking portrait come from. So I was sort of intrigued by that, and then to discover that Edward Winslow came back and worked for Cromwell and actually was one of the commissioners in charge of sort of bargaining with royalists for their lands. But he was a kind-hearted man in that his sister was married to a royal rebel in the West Country, and he actually rescued his nephew from being executed because he was endlessly part of rebellions. And very curiously, that family actually produces someone called they were called the Wakes, and Archbishop Wake, who was Archbishop of Canterbury. So it's very odd that Archbishop of Canterbury was a sort of collateral descendant of these radicals, really.
Yes.
So I just became very curious for lots of reasons.
Yes, they were extraordinary people, who embraced the godly cause at such immense personal cost. Did you find it difficult kind of getting into the Puritan mindset? Because, good historical writing such as your own is not just the accumulation of information, it's very much bringing it to life with the human angle. And they were so extraordinary. I just wondered how that was.
I found it so complex. It sort of made my head ache. I'm just sure you know all about it, but I find it very, very hard to work out who was thinking what, and then everything sort of dissolved, and then separatists weren't. But it's also very exciting that people are grappling with these huge issues, and I was very intrigued by all these tiny churches in the end producing the sort of founder of the Baptist movement, and it's sort of Nottinghamshire was a sort of crucible, South Yorkshire of people discussing and debating, and so that was. I found all that fascinating, but extremely hard work. And then you get marvellous sort of writers from the other point of view, like Richard Hooker, and then you start to think, oh, gosh. I mean, I think Puritanism, in a way, is a very attractive religion. It's sort of a very attractive thing. It's not quite like Extinction Rebellion, but it's a sort of take no prisoners religion.
There's a purity about
purity,
it.
Yes.
Yes, indeed. One of the things I love about your book is there are some lovely kind of quirky details. I love the fact that you refer to Edward Winslow's fondness for Dutch cheese, and that they arrive in the New World with these kind of crate loads of cheese. And also, something I hadn't realised was that there were real questions about how seaworthy the Mayflower was.
Yes.
So I wondered, is there anything that really surprised you in, there's so much, there's a wealth of detail, but in your researches, is there anything that came as a...
There was, speaking of cheese, this extraordinary reference to butter. In sort of primary sources, they brought sort of 100 weight of butter and cheese. And I was very intrigued as to, did they buy the butter? I presume they made it themselves. Why did they take butter? And I think it was for barter. The idea was but in fact they had to sell a lot of it at Southampton Harbour because they were just sitting there, because in fact William Brewster had gone on the run because the Netherlands started to cave in. They needed an ally against the coming war, so they start sort of saying, oh, okay, all foreign churches who were rude to James I out. And William Brewster vanishes, and then they are sitting at Southampton for about 2 months waiting for him to arrive, and they start having to sell everything because the harbour masters are saying, well, you can't just sit here forever, and they have to sell their armour, and that's why they set off. That's why they land in sort of November, as they were meant to leave in July, then they would have arrived in September. But because of the delays, problem with money, raising funds, they don't get there till New England winter is hitting, and that was very, very...
Thank you. I've just been handed a question which says, was the parish of St Bride's known for nonconformists in the early 17th century?
I'm going to ask you.
I knew that would end up coming back my way. Certainly there was a tradition of extreme Protestantism in this church from fairly early on. I mean, even during the time of Edward VI, you have a man called John Cardmaker, who was a very outspoken Protestant who ends up being burnt at the stake at Smithfield for his extreme views. So I think there was, to some extent, a tradition during that time here. But of course, it depends where you are on the spectrum. And I think certainly there are one or two of the clergy, the ministers here during that period, who didn't quite cut it with the hotter sorts of Puritans.
No.
So I think, yes, certainly there was some tradition of if you like, non-conformity here during that period. But I think it depends which minister you're talking about.
I mean, I think that what I find very interesting and mysterious is that, and this is true of William Brewster and his little church, is that for quite a long period, people continue who are separatists, having their own little secret churches, and they will also still go to their parish church. And the lectureships were sort of set up, weren't they, as a way around this, so you could sort of disagree with what you were hearing, or from your parish priest, but you could then go to a lectureship paid for by sort of a corporation, and that's where things flourished. And so in a way it was a parallel system going on.
Absolutely, rather a neat solution to a very considerable problem. Do you think there's anything we can learn from them today?
Yes, I think that John Robinson, he was really a sort of extraordinary person. I think they, as seen by their view of Quakers, of wanting to have freedom of religion, I think that separatist people were very open-minded, very independently minded, and I think they were very tolerant people. I think that's what they prided themselves on. I mean, I think sadly Edward Winslow and William Bradford sort of changed. I think people did change over time, but their protests against the enslaving of the American Indians were really very, very strong, and they sort of... So, no, I think virtues of toleration, we can learn that.
Which is a splendid note upon which to end. I would like to thank all of our online viewers, especially those of you in the United States. It's wonderful that we have a global audience tonight. Thank you all for joining us, but our heartfelt thanks above all, of course, to Rebecca. You've given us a marvellous lecture. We have been educated, edified, and entertained by your wisdom and your words. And we are profoundly grateful to you.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.